A black boy bursts into a hospital, clutching two white twins yelling for help, but no one moves. Eyes freeze on the shocking sight of a young black boy with white infants. As whispers of suspicion fill the air, the tension peaks. Who is this boy? Where did the twins come from? And why is he the only one fighting to save their lives? The answers will reveal a story of heroism, prejudice, and an act of kindness that changes everything. What would you do in his place? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Adrian adjusted his backpack as he walked down Monroe Street, passing by Mr. Johnson's corner store where the smell of fresh bread always made his stomach growl. The afternoon sun warmed his face, and he quickened his pace knowing his younger siblings would be waiting at their neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment. His mom, Vanessa, wouldn't be home from her nursing shift until late tonight, so it was up to him to make sure everyone had dinner and finished their homework. The familiar sights of his neighborhood brought comfort: the old oak trees lining the sidewalk, kids playing double dutch on the corner, and the local ice cream truck's distant jingle. Adrian took pride in being the responsible one, even though sometimes he wished he could just hang out with his friends after school like other 12-year-olds. At home, Adrian moved through his usual routine with practiced ease. He helped his sister with her math homework while making mac and cheese for dinner, checking his brother's spelling worksheet between stirring the pot. The kitchen window was open, letting in a gentle breeze that carried the sounds of city life: car horns, distant sirens, and the chatter of neighbors. Then everything changed in an instant. The horrible screech of tires pierced the air, followed by the sickening crunch of metal meeting metal. The sound came from the intersection just around the corner, where Maple and 4th Street met. Adrian's heart jumped into his throat. Without thinking, he told his siblings to stay put and ran outside. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. A white SUV lay on its side, smoke rising from the crumpled hood like angry gray fingers reaching for the sky. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled his nostrils as he got closer. Other people stood frozen on the sidewalk, some with phones already pressed to their ears, presumably calling 911. That's when he heard it. Faint cries coming from inside the vehicle. Not adult cries, but the unmistakable wails of babies. Adrian's feet moved before his brain could process the danger. As he got closer to the overturned SUV, he could see a woman slumped over in the driver's seat, her blonde hair covering her face. She wasn't moving. The smoke from the hood was getting thicker, and something in his gut told him there wasn't much time. Peering through the rear window, which was now facing sideways, he saw them. 2 baby carriers secured in the back seat, each holding a tiny infant. Their faces were red from crying, little arms reaching out desperately. They looked identical. Twins, probably no more than 6 months old. The car groaned, shifting slightly on its side, and Adrian's heart raced faster. He knew from science class that smoke meant fire was possible, and he couldn't wait for help to arrive. The rear door was damaged but not locked. With trembling hands, he managed to pull it open. The heat from the engine made sweat bead on his forehead as he carefully climbed halfway into the vehicle. The twins' cries grew louder, almost desperate now. One at a time, he unbuckled their car seats, speaking softly to them as he worked. It's okay," he whispered, his voice shaking but gentle. "I've got you." The first baby, he would later learn was Emily, came free easily. He carefully passed her to a woman who had finally approached to help. The second baby, Ethan, took more effort as the buckle was stuck, but Adrian remained calm, just like his mother had taught him during stressful situations. Finally, both twins were safely away from the smoking vehicle, cradled in the arms of bystanders who had gathered to help. Adrian's heart was pounding, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline, but a sense of relief washed over him as he heard sirens approaching in the distance. Adrian's legs burned as he ran down Monroe Street, a twin cradled carefully in each arm. Their tiny faces were still red from crying, though they had settled somewhat against his chest. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as he weaved through crowds of startled onlookers. "Please, I need to get to Metro General," he called out, his voice cracking with urgency. "These babies need help." People turned to stare at the sight of a young black boy carrying 2 white infants. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others whispered among themselves. A middle-aged woman in a business suit stepped forward. "Let me call an ambulance," she offered, reaching for her phone. Adrian shook his head, still moving. "No time, the hospital's just 3 blocks away." His mother had taken him there many times when she worked extra shifts. He knew the fastest route. An elderly man tried to stop him. "Son, maybe you should wait for—" "They need help now," Adrian insisted, pushing past. The twins were getting fussy again, perhaps sensing his anxiety. He whispered soft reassurances as he ran, just as he did with his younger siblings when they were upset. His sneakers pounded against the sidewalk as he rounded the corner onto Hospital Drive. The modern glass building of Metro General loomed ahead, its emergency room entrance like a beacon of hope. His lungs felt like they were on fire, but he didn't slow down. Adrian burst through the sliding doors of the ER, the air conditioning hitting his sweat-soaked face. "Help!" he called out, his voice echoing through the waiting room. "Please, these babies were in a car crash." The bustling emergency room suddenly grew quiet. Nurses stopped mid-stride, clipboard-holding doctors paused their conversations, and patients in the waiting area stared openly. Nobody moved. The silence was deafening, broken only by one of the twins beginning to whimper. A security guard took a step forward, his expression uncertain. The receptionist behind the desk reached for her phone, her eyes never leaving Adrian's face. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unspoken assumptions. "Their mom's still trapped in the car," Adrian explained, his voice trembling. "The car was smoking, I had to get them out. Please." Just then, a tall woman in a white coat stepped forward from the crowd. Her name tag read, Dr. Lauren Taylor, Pediatrics. Her warm brown eyes met Adrian's with understanding and compassion. "I'll take them, sweetheart," she said calmly, already reaching for the twins. Her voice carried authority that seemed to break the spell of inaction in the room. "What are their names?" I don't know," Adrian admitted, carefully transferring the babies to her capable hands. "They're twins. They were in a white SUV at Maple and 4th. Dr. Taylor nodded, quickly assessing the infants. "Nancy, Paige, I need you with me," she called out to 2 nurses. "And someone contact emergency services about the mother." The professional calm in her voice helped ease some of Adrian's anxiety. She turned back to Adrian, her expression softening. "You did the right thing bringing them here. They look okay, but we'll check them thoroughly to make sure." She gestured to another nurse. "Sarah, please stay with this brave young man. I want to talk to him after I examine these little ones." As Dr. Taylor rushed away with the twins, the emergency room burst back into action. Phones rang, people moved about, and voices filled the air once again. Adrian stood there, his arms feeling strangely empty, as Nurse Sarah guided him to a chair in the waiting area. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Adrian sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his hands fidgeting in his lap. A security guard named Thompson stood nearby, his arms crossed and his expression stern. The nurse, Sarah, had brought Adrian a cup of water, but it remained untouched on the small table beside him. "So let me get this straight," Officer Thompson said, pulling out a small notepad. "You just happened to find these 2 babies and decided to run them to the hospital?" His tone made it clear he didn't believe the story. Adrian's throat felt tight. "There was a car crash," he explained again, his voice small but steady. "At Maple and 4th. The car was upside down, and there was smoke coming from it. Their mom was unconscious in the front seat." Another security guard joined them, speaking in hushed tones with Thompson. Adrian caught fragments of their conversation, checked the police scanner, and no reports yet. "Young man, taking someone else's children is a very serious matter," Thompson said, his voice growing sterner. "We need to contact your parents and—" "My mom's at work," Adrian said quickly. "She works at the grocery store on Pine Street. You can call her, but please, you have to help the twins' mom first." His eyes stung with frustrated tears. The guards exchanged doubtful glances, and Adrian's heart sank. He understood why they were suspicious. He'd seen how people sometimes looked at him differently because of his skin color. But right now, all he cared about was making sure everyone from the accident was safe. Just then, Dr. Lauren Taylor strode back into the waiting area, her white coat swishing with purpose. Officer Thompson, she called out firmly, I need you to contact emergency services about the crash site. Those babies didn't appear out of nowhere, and there could be others who need help. Thompson hesitated. Doctor, we need to establish… What we need, Dr. Taylor interrupted, her voice kind but leaving no room for argument, is to focus on patient care first. Those twins are real, they're here, and they need medical attention. Everything else can wait. She turned to Adrian, her expression softening. Would you mind staying a while longer? I'd like to hear more about what happened, and you might be able to help us identify the family. Adrian nodded gratefully, relief washing over him. Are Emily and Ethan okay? The name slipped out naturally. He'd heard their mother calling them that just before he'd pulled them from the car. Dr. Taylor's eyebrows rose slightly. You know their names? I heard their mom say them, Adrian explained. Right before. He swallowed hard, remembering the scary scene. Dr. Taylor gestured for him to follow her down a hallway. They stopped at a large window looking into a treatment room where nurses were tending to the twins. Both babies were awake now, their tiny faces scrunched up as they were examined. They appear to be perfectly fine, Dr. Taylor said softly, watching Adrian's concerned expression. No injuries that we can see. You must have been very careful with them. Adrian pressed his hand against the glass, relief flooding through him. I tried to hold them, just like I hold my baby sister when Mom needs help, he said quietly. Dr. Taylor studied him thoughtfully, noting how his eyes never left the twins, how his shoulders remained tense with worry. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had done something wrong. This was genuine concern from someone who cared deeply about others. Tell me everything that happened, she said gently, pulling up 2 chairs near the window. Start from the beginning. The hospital corridor fell silent as Officer Martinez approached, her face etched with concern. Dr. Taylor and Adrian both stood up from their seats by the window, tension filling the air. We've confirmed the accident site, Officer Martinez said, her voice professional but gentle. The mother, Mrs. Rebecca Collins, was transported to Memorial Hospital. She's in critical condition in their trauma unit. Adrian's heart seemed to skip a beat. Is she… He struggled to find the words, his throat tight. Is she going to be okay? Officer Martinez's expression softened as she looked at the young boy. I'm sorry, but I don't have any details about her condition right now. The doctors at Memorial are doing everything they can for her. Adrian's shoulders slumped and Dr. Taylor placed a reassuring hand on his back. Just then, a cry erupted from the pediatric ward where the twins were being kept. Without hesitation, Adrian turned toward the sound. Can I… He glanced at Dr. Taylor, his eyes pleading. Can I see them? Dr. Taylor nodded, leading Adrian into the ward while Officer Martinez stayed behind to coordinate with hospital staff. The twins were in adjacent cribs, both fussy and red-faced. Emily was the one crying, her tiny fists waving in the air. They're probably scared, Adrian said softly, approaching Emily's crib. Everything's different, and their mom isn't here. With gentle movements he'd learned from caring for his own sister, he reached down and carefully stroked Emily's cheek. Her cries began to soften. Dr. Taylor watched in amazement as Adrian hummed a quiet lullaby, one his mother had sung to him and his siblings countless times. Emily's eyes began to flutter, and even Ethan turned his head toward the sound. You're really good with them, Dr. Taylor observed, noting how naturally Adrian switched between soothing each twin. Have you taken care of babies before? Adrian nodded, still focused on the twins. My little sister, Grace. Mom works long hours, so I help out a lot. Emily and Ethan remind me of her when she was this small. Dr. Taylor pulled up 2 chairs and they sat watching the twins slowly calm down. After a few minutes of peaceful silence, she turned to Adrian. Can I ask you something? When he nodded, she continued gently. Why didn't you wait for emergency services at the crash site? Most people would have stayed there. Adrian's hands trembled slightly as he remembered the scene. The smoke, he said quietly. There was so much smoke coming from the car. I know you're supposed to wait for help, but… He took a shaky breath. Last year there was a car fire on our street. It happened so fast. I kept thinking about that. And when I saw the smoke today, his voice cracked. I just couldn't wait. I couldn't risk it. Not with the babies in there. Dr. Taylor's eyes filled with understanding. You were scared for them. I was terrified, Adrian admitted, watching as Ethan wrapped his tiny hand around Adrian's finger. Maybe I should have waited, but I just kept thinking about how fast that other car caught fire. And their mom. His voice dropped to a whisper. She wasn't moving at all. I didn't know what to do except get them somewhere safe as fast as I could. You acted on instinct to protect them, Dr. Taylor said softly, watching as both twins drifted off to sleep, soothed by Adrian's presence. Sometimes, in emergencies, that's exactly what needs to happen. The hospital doors burst open as a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the sterile floor. Richard Collins's face was a mask of worry and anger as he approached the nurse's station. "Where are my children?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the corridor. "I was told Emily and Ethan are here." Dr. Lauren Taylor stepped forward, maintaining her professional composure. "Mr. Collins, I'm Dr. Taylor. Your children are safe and stable in our pediatric ward." Richard's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his jaw remained tense. "What happened? I got a call about Rebecca." His voice caught for a moment. "They said there was an accident and someone took my children from the scene?" Adrian, who had been sitting quietly nearby, stood up. Dr. Taylor gestured toward him. "This is Adrian. He's the one who helped your children." Richard's eyes narrowed as he looked at Adrian, taking in his worn sneakers and school backpack. "You took my children?" His voice was sharp with disbelief. "A child?" "Sir, Adrian started, but Richard cut him off. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" Richard's voice rose. "You could have injured them, moving accident victims without proper training. What were you thinking?" Adrian took a step back, his hands trembling. "The car was smoking," he explained, his voice small but steady. "I was worried about fire. I just wanted to get them somewhere safe." "Safe?" Richard scoffed. "You ran through the streets with 2 infants. No emergency services, no proper medical care. That's not safe. That's reckless." Dr. Taylor stepped between them. "Mr. Collins, I understand you're upset, but Adrian's quick thinking may have saved your children's lives. Or he could have made things worse." Richard ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "How do we even know what really happened? For all we know, he could have." "I was trying to help." Adrian's voice cracked with emotion. "There was so much smoke and your wife wasn't moving. I couldn't just leave them there." "Mr. Collins," Dr. Taylor interjected firmly, "there should be security footage from the intersection where the accident occurred. We can request that from the police to verify Adrian's account." Richard paused, straightening his tie. "Yes, I want to see that footage. I want to know exactly what happened." "The police are already gathering evidence," Dr. Taylor assured him. "But right now, your children are safe and well cared for. Would you like to see them?" Richard nodded stiffly, but his eyes lingered suspiciously on Adrian. "I want to be clear. I appreciate anyone helping my children, but running off with them." He shook his head. "That's not how these situations should be handled." Adrian stood his ground, though his voice was quiet. "I know it wasn't perfect, sir, but I did what I thought was right. I got them help as fast as I could." Dr. Taylor placed a gentle hand on Adrian's shoulder. "Let's focus on what matters. Emily and Ethan are safe. The security footage will show us exactly what happened at the scene." The tension in the corridor was thick as a nurse appeared to guide Richard to his children. Before following her, he turned back to Dr. Taylor. "I want to see that footage as soon as it's available, and I want to know everything that happened to my children between the crash and their arrival here." As Richard disappeared down the hallway, Adrian sank back into his chair, his hands still shaking slightly. Dr. Taylor sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring as they waited for the police to arrive with the security footage that would tell the full story. In a dimly lit security office at the hospital, Adrian, Richard, and Dr. Lauren Taylor gathered around a small monitor. The security officer clicked through several camera angles until he found the intersection where the accident occurred. The footage was crystal clear. They watched as Rebecca's white SUV was struck by another vehicle, rolling onto its side. Smoke began curling from under the hood almost immediately. The timestamp showed 3:42 p.m. "There," the security officer pointed. "That's when the boy arrived." On screen, Adrian appeared at 3:44 p.m., dropping his backpack and approaching the vehicle cautiously. The smoke was getting thicker now. They watched as he checked on Rebecca first, then discovered the twins in the back. With careful movements, he managed to unbuckle both car seats and lift the babies out one at a time. Richard leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. The smoke was now pouring from the engine compartment. Moments after Adrian carried the twins away, flames began flickering beneath the hood. "My God," Richard whispered, his face pale. "If he hadn't—" Dr. Taylor touched his arm gently. The fire department's report indicates the engine caught fire less than 2 minutes later. The flames spread quickly because of a fuel line rupture. Richard turned to Adrian, his eyes glistening. I was so wrong." His voice cracked with emotion. "You didn't just help my children, you saved their lives." Adrian shifted uncomfortably under the attention, looking down at his worn sneakers. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Richard shook his head firmly. "Most people would have waited, called for help, maybe tried to comfort them from outside. But that smoke—" He looked back at the screen where firefighters were now battling the flames. "You knew there wasn't time for that." Dr. Taylor smiled warmly at Adrian. "It takes extraordinary courage to act so decisively in a crisis, especially at your age. You should be very proud." Richard wiped his eyes with his silk handkerchief. "I need to apologize properly. I was terrified when I heard someone had taken my children from an accident scene. I jumped to the worst conclusions without even giving you a chance to explain." He extended his hand to Adrian. "I'm truly sorry." Adrian shook his hand, managing a small smile. "It's okay, sir. I understand why you were worried." "Tell me about yourself, Adrian," Richard said, pulling up a chair. "Dr. Taylor mentioned you were walking home from school when this happened." "Yes, sir. I usually pick up my little brother and sister from their after-school program, but today they were home sick with our mom." "Your mother must be worried sick by now," Dr. Taylor realized, checking her watch. "She's probably still sleeping," Adrian explained. "She works night shifts at the hospital across town. She's a nursing assistant." Richard's expression softened further. "A healthcare worker? That explains your instincts for helping others." He paused thoughtfully. "Does she know you're here?" "Not yet. I didn't want to wake her up. She works so hard and it's tough for her to get enough sleep between shifts." Dr. Taylor and Richard exchanged glances, both moved by Adrian's consideration for his mother, even in the midst of such an extraordinary situation. "Would you like me to call her?" Dr. Taylor offered. "As a doctor, I might be able to explain things in a way that won't worry her too much." Before Adrian could respond, Richard interjected. "Please let me help with that. It's the least I can do." He turned to Adrian, his earlier suspicion completely replaced by genuine warmth. "I'd like to meet your mother properly and tell her what a remarkable son she has." Richard slumped into a chair in the hospital lounge, his expensive suit wrinkled and his tie loosened. His hands were still trembling from watching the security footage. Dr. Lauren Taylor sat across from him, her gentle presence providing a stark contrast to his agitated state. "I can't believe I treated him that way," Richard muttered, running his fingers through his graying hair. "That boy." He didn't hesitate for a second. Dr. Taylor leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Adrian is quite remarkable. In all my years of pediatrics, I've rarely seen someone so young handle a crisis with such maturity." "I saw nothing but a stranger with my children," Richard admitted, shame evident in his voice. "I didn't even try to understand." "It's not too late to change that," Dr. Taylor suggested. "Adrian's still here, watching over Emily and Ethan. Maybe you should talk to him. Really talk to him." Richard nodded slowly, straightening his tie. "You're right. I owe him that much at least." In the pediatric ward, Adrian sat in a rocking chair between the twins' bassinets. Emily was fussy, making small whimpering sounds that threatened to turn into full cries. Adrian hummed softly, reaching out to stroke her tiny hand with his finger. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," he sang quietly, his voice gentle and soothing. "How I wonder what you are." Richard paused in the doorway, watching as Adrian tenderly cared for his children. Ethan was already sleeping peacefully, while Emily's whimpers gradually subsided under Adrian's attention. When Adrian noticed Richard's presence, he stiffened slightly but kept his voice steady for Emily's sake. "Hello, sir," he whispered, carefully pulling his hand back. "Please," Richard said, pulling up a chair nearby. "Don't stop on my account. You have quite a way with them." Adrian relaxed slightly, though his shoulders remained tense. "I help take care of my little brother and sister a lot. They're 4, but they still like lullabies when they're upset." Richard watched as Emily finally drifted off to sleep. "Adrian, I need to thank you properly, not just for saving them, but for staying with them, comforting them." "It's okay, sir. Really." "No, it's not okay," Richard insisted, keeping his voice low. "I judged you without knowing anything about you. Would you tell me about yourself?" Adrian studied Richard's face, searching for sincerity. Finding it, he spoke softly. "Well, I live about 20 minutes from here with my mom and the twins. My siblings, I mean. Mom works really hard as a nursing assistant, usually night shifts." "That must be difficult," Richard commented. "Sometimes. But she always makes time for us, no matter how tired she is." Pride crept into Adrian's voice. "She reads to the twins every morning when she gets home, even though she probably just wants to sleep. And she never misses my science fairs, even if she has to change shifts." Richard noticed how Adrian's whole demeanor changed when talking about his family. The wariness melted away, replaced by genuine warmth. "You help take care of your siblings often?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir. Mom needs the rest and I don't mind. The twins are pretty fun when they're not being too crazy." Adrian smiled slightly. "They're learning to read now, and they think every sign we pass needs to be sounded out." Richard chuckled softly, glancing at his own sleeping twins. "You know, Emily and Ethan are lucky you were there today. Not just because you saved them, but because you knew exactly how to comfort them afterward." The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor. Vanessa burst into the pediatric ward, still wearing her nursing assistant scrubs from her shift. Her face was a mix of worry and anger as she spotted Adrian sitting between the twin bassinets. "Adrian James Thompson!" Her voice was sharp but hushed, mindful of the sleeping babies. "What were you thinking? Mrs. Rodriguez from next door just told me you ran into a burning car?" Adrian stood up quickly, his eyes wide. "Mom, it wasn't burning yet. There was just smoke, and the babies were crying and—" "Just smoke?" Vanessa's hands trembled as she grabbed Adrian's shoulders, checking him for injuries. "Do you have any idea what could have happened to you? What if that car had exploded?" "But Mom, I couldn't just leave them there," Adrian protested, his voice cracking slightly. "They were so small, and they were scared. I heard them crying, and I had to help." "You should have waited for the emergency services," Vanessa insisted, pulling him into a tight hug despite her anger. "You're 12 years old, Adrian, 12. You're supposed to stay safe, not run into dangerous situations." Richard, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stood up from his chair. "Mrs. Thompson?" Vanessa turned, instinctively pulling Adrian closer to her side. "Yes?" "I'm Richard Bennett, Emily and Ethan's father," he said, gesturing to the sleeping twins. "Your son. He didn't just help my children. He saved their lives." Vanessa's expression softened slightly, but her arm remained protective around Adrian's shoulders. "I understand that, Mr. Bennett. But he's my baby. He could have been hurt." "Please call me Richard," he said gently. "And I understand your fear completely. But I've just watched the security footage of what happened. The car, it caught fire shortly after Adrian got my children out. If he hadn't acted when he did..." Richard's voice trailed off, heavy with emotion. Vanessa looked down at Adrian, who was watching her with pleading eyes. "Is that true?" "Dr. Taylor has the footage," Richard offered. Your son didn't just act bravely. He was careful, focused, and incredibly gentle with Emily and Ethan. You've raised an extraordinary young man." Vanessa's stern expression finally crumbled, and tears welled up in her eyes. She guided Adrian to a nearby chair, sitting down heavily. "It's not easy, you know. Raising 3 kids on my own, working night shifts, trying to teach them right from wrong." Richard pulled his chair closer, his expression thoughtful. "I can't imagine doing it alone. My wife and I struggle even with our resources, and we have help." "We manage," Vanessa said proudly, running her hand over Adrian's hair. "We don't have much, but we have each other. And apparently," she added with a watery smile, "I have a son who's braver than I ever knew." "Mom," Adrian whispered, embarrassed but pleased. "You should be proud," Richard said sincerely. "Not just of his bravery, but of his compassion. He's been here for hours comforting Emily and Ethan. He even knows how to calm them when they cry, something I'm still learning to do." Vanessa looked at the sleeping twins, then back at her son. Her anger had completely dissolved, replaced by a complex mixture of pride and lingering concern. "That's because he helps with his brother and sister all the time. Sometimes I worry it's too much responsibility for his age." "He's told me a little about your family," Richard said softly. "About how you never miss his science fairs, even after night shifts. About how you read to the twins every morning." Dr. Lauren Taylor entered the room, her clipboard tucked under her arm and a warm smile on her face. The tension in the air immediately shifted as everyone turned to hear her update. "Emily and Ethan are doing remarkably well," she announced, her voice gentle but confident. "Their vital signs are stable, and the initial tests show no signs of trauma or injury. However," she added, looking at Richard, "we'd like to keep them here overnight for observation, just to be safe." Adrian, who had been holding his breath without realizing it, let out a long sigh of relief, but then his face clouded over, and he looked down at his hands. "What about their mom?" he asked quietly. I left her there in the car. Maybe I should have tried to help her too." Dr. Taylor moved closer, pulling up a chair to sit at eye level with Adrian. "Adrian, look at me," she said softly. The boy raised his eyes reluctantly to meet hers. "In emergency situations, seconds can make the difference between life and death. The twins were your priority because they were the most vulnerable, and you made exactly the right choice." "But," Adrian started to protest. "No buts," Dr. Taylor interrupted gently. "Let me explain something about emergencies. When there's smoke coming from a car after an accident, there's no time to hesitate. The emergency crews arrived just minutes after you left with the twins, and they had the proper equipment to help their mother. If you had stayed and tried to help her, you might have put yourself in danger, and the twins might have been exposed to smoke or worse." Adrian absorbed her words, his shoulders gradually relaxing. "Really?" "Really," Dr. Taylor confirmed. "In fact, the paramedics who arrived at the scene reported that the car caught fire shortly after they got Mrs. Bennett out. Your quick thinking and action saved Emily and Ethan from being exposed to those dangerous conditions." As if on cue, one of the twins, Emily, began to stir in her bassinet. Without hesitation, Adrian stood up and walked over to her. His movements were natural and practiced as he gently adjusted her blanket and softly hummed a lullaby he often used with his younger siblings. Richard watched from the doorway, struck by the scene before him. The same boy whom he had initially regarded with suspicion was now tenderly caring for his children, with an instinct that seemed almost innate. Emily settled quickly under Adrian's attention, her tiny hand wrapping around his finger. "He's got quite a gift," Dr. Taylor said quietly to Richard, joining him at the doorway. "It's rare to see someone so young with such natural caregiving abilities." Richard nodded, his eyes never leaving the scene. "He mentioned earlier that he wants to be a doctor someday," he said thoughtfully. "Watching him with the twins, I can see why. He has the perfect temperament for it." Adrian continued his gentle ministrations, unaware of the conversation behind him. He moved between the twins' bassinets, checking on Ethan as well, making sure both babies were comfortable and peaceful. His earlier guilt had been replaced by a calm focus on the twins' well-being. As Richard observed Adrian's careful attention to his children, something shifted in his expression. His eyes lit up with an idea, and he turned to Dr. Taylor with a questioning look. She recognized the expression of someone forming a plan, but before Richard could share his thoughts, Ethan began to fuss, and Adrian was already there, ready to comfort him. The quiet afternoon at the hospital was interrupted by the sharp click of heels against linoleum floors. A woman in a crisp blazer strode purposefully through the pediatric ward, her press badge swinging from her neck. Her arrival immediately caught the attention of the nursing staff, who exchanged worried glances. "I'm looking for the boy who rescued the Bennett twins," the reporter announced, her voice carrying through the corridor. "Sarah Chen from the Daily Chronicle." Adrian, who had been reading a story to the twins in their room, tensed at the sound of voices outside. His hands gripped the book tighter as the reporter appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "There you are." She stepped into the room, already pulling out her phone to record. "The hero of the hour. Tell me, what was going through your mind when you saw that smoking car? Did you worry about your own safety? Some people are questioning why a young boy was wandering around that neighborhood alone." Adrian's throat went dry. The questions came rapid fire, each one making him shrink further into his chair. He glanced desperately toward the door, wishing he could disappear. "Were you afraid the parents might misunderstand your intentions? Have you had any previous experience with emergency situations?" I just wanted to help," Adrian managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "The babies were crying." Dr. Lauren Taylor appeared in the doorway, her usual warm expression replaced by stern professionalism. "Excuse me," she interrupted, stepping between Adrian and the reporter. "This is a pediatric ward, and you're disturbing our patients." "Dr. Taylor, surely you can comment on the situation," Sarah Chen pivoted smoothly. "Isn't it unusual for a child to take such drastic action? Some might say it was reckless." "What's unusual?" Richard's voice cut through the tension as he entered the room. "Is a reporter harassing a minor without parental consent?" He moved to stand beside Dr. Taylor, creating a protective barrier between Adrian and the reporter. "Mr. Bennett," Sarah brightened, "your perspective would be valuable. How did you feel when you learned about the circumstances of your children's rescue?" "I feel grateful," Richard stated firmly. "Adrian showed extraordinary courage and compassion. That's the story here, nothing more, nothing less." His tone left no room for alternative interpretations. Dr. Taylor nodded in agreement. Adrian's quick thinking saved 2 lives. He demonstrated exactly the kind of community spirit we should be celebrating, not questioning. The reporter's phone was still recording, but her enthusiasm had dimmed in the face of their united front. She glanced around them at Adrian, who was now gently rocking Ethan's bassinet as the baby stirred restlessly. "Just one photo," she pressed. "The public would love to see the young hero with the babies he saved." Before anyone could object, she raised her camera and snapped a quick picture. The flash startled Emily, who began to cry, and Adrian immediately moved to comfort her, his own discomfort forgotten in his concern for the twin. "I think we're done here," Richard said firmly, gesturing toward the door. "Any further coverage of this story will need to go through proper channels." As security arrived to escort the reporter out, Adrian's shoulders slumped with relief. His hands were trembling slightly as he tucked Emily's blanket around her. "Don't worry about her," Richard said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Adrian's shoulder. "I'll make sure any story published focuses on the facts, your bravery and quick thinking. Nothing else." Dr. Taylor smiled warmly at Adrian. "Some people will try to make this more complicated than it is, but we know the truth. You're a young man who did the right thing when it mattered most." Richard's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket as he sat in the hospital's family room. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number of the accident investigator he'd hired. His face grew serious as he stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Mr. Bennett," the investigator's voice crackled through the speaker. "We've completed our preliminary investigation of the vehicle. You'll want to hear this." Richard listened intently, his expression darkening with each word. His free hand clenched into a fist as the investigator detailed their findings. "You're telling me the brake failure wasn't random?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. No, sir. We found documentation showing the manufacturer knew about this defect for at least 2 years. They chose not to issue a recall, likely due to cost considerations. After ending the call, Richard paced the hallway, trying to process this information. Dr. Lauren Taylor noticed his agitation as she passed by with her charts. "Richard, is everything all right?" she asked, concerned by his troubled expression. "No, it's not," he replied, running a hand through his hair. Could you get Vanessa? She should hear this too." Minutes later, they gathered in the quiet corner of the hospital's family room. Vanessa had just finished her nursing shift, still in her scrubs, while Adrian sat quietly nearby, pretending to read but clearly listening. "The brake failure wasn't an accident," Richard explained, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "The manufacturer knew about the defect. They knew it could happen, and they did nothing." Dr. Taylor's eyes widened. "They deliberately kept this information from the public?" "Profit over people," Vanessa said softly, shaking her head. "Reminds me of what happened to Mrs. Johnson down the street from us last year. Remember, Adrian? Her diabetes medication was recalled, but not before it made her sick. The company knew about the contamination for months." Adrian looked up from his book, his young face troubled as he absorbed the conversation. How many other families could be driving these cars right now? Richard wondered aloud, pacing the small space. How many other children could be in danger? "You have the resources to do something about this, Richard," Dr. Taylor suggested, leaning forward in her chair. "Your company's legal team, your connections in the business world. You could make sure this doesn't get buried." Vanessa nodded in agreement. "Sometimes it takes someone with influence to make these big companies listen, to make them face what they've done." Adrian watched the adults talking, suddenly seeing his rescue of the twins in a different light. It wasn't just about saving Emily and Ethan anymore. His actions had uncovered something much bigger, something that could help protect other families. "The public needs to know," Richard declared, his businessman's demeanor returning as he formulated a plan. "We need to force them to issue a recall before anyone else gets hurt." Dr. Taylor glanced at Adrian, noting how intently he was following the conversation. "Your quick thinking didn't just save the twins, Adrian. You might have helped save many other people too." Adrian shifted in his seat, both proud and uncomfortable with the attention. He hadn't thought about his actions having such far-reaching consequences. He'd just wanted to help those babies, but now he was beginning to understand how one person's choices could ripple out to affect so many others. Richard paced nervously in the hospital's family consultation room, straightening his tie for the third time. He'd asked Adrian and Vanessa to meet him here, away from the busy corridors and prying eyes. The small room, with its soft beige walls and comfortable chairs, felt more personal than the stark hospital hallways. When Vanessa arrived with Adrian, still in her nursing scrubs after her shift, Richard gestured for them to sit on the plush sofa while he took the chair across from them. Adrian noticed Richard was holding a wrapped package carefully placed on the side table. "Thank you both for coming," Richard began, his usual businesslike demeanor softening. "These past few days have made me do a lot of thinking, about family, about what really matters." He paused, looking directly at Adrian. "Your bravery saved my children, but it's more than that. You've shown me what true character looks like." Adrian ducked his head, uncomfortable with the praise. Vanessa placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "I know you work long hours, Vanessa," Richard continued, his voice gentle. "And I've seen how responsible Adrian is with his siblings. I'd like to help make things easier for your family." Vanessa stiffened slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'd like to set up a fund," Richard explained, leaning forward. "It would cover your basic expenses, allowing you to reduce your hours at the hospital. You could spend more time with your children." He held up a hand as Vanessa began to protest. "This isn't charity. It's about giving back to the family that saved mine." Adrian looked up at his mother, seeing the conflict on her face. She'd always taught him to stand on his own 2 feet, to never expect handouts. "Mr. Bennett," Vanessa said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I've always managed on my own. I don't want my children thinking. Thinking what? Richard interrupted gently. That their mother deserves recognition for raising such an extraordinary son? That their family's hard work and integrity touched someone's heart? He smiled warmly. This isn't about owing anyone anything, it's about showing gratitude in a meaningful way. Adrian spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. I didn't help Emily and Ethan because I wanted anything in return. I couldn't leave them there. Richard's eyes grew misty. I know, son. That's exactly why you deserve this. He reached for the wrapped package and handed it to Adrian. This is just a small token of appreciation. Adrian carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a silver-framed photograph. In it, Emily and Ethan were sleeping peacefully in their hospital cribs, and below the image was a small engraved plaque that read, Our Hero. The simplicity of the gesture brought tears to Adrian's eyes. They'll grow up knowing about you, Richard said softly. About the brave boy who saved their lives without thinking twice. Vanessa looked at the photo over Adrian's shoulder, her resistance beginning to soften. She saw the genuine emotion in Richard's eyes, the way he looked at Adrian with such respect and gratitude. Maybe, she said slowly, we could discuss the details of your offer. But I'd want to be clear about expectations and boundaries. Richard nodded, understanding her caution. Of course. Whatever makes you comfortable. This isn't about changing your lives. It's about making them a little easier. Adrian held the frame carefully in his hands, tracing the engraved words with his finger. The twins in the photo looked so peaceful, so different from the frightening moment he'd pulled them from the car. For the first time, he felt truly proud of what he'd done, not because of the recognition, but because he could see the real impact of his actions in their peaceful faces. Vanessa's key jangled in the lock of their small apartment, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. The events of the day had left her emotionally drained. As she stepped inside, the familiar sight of their worn but well-kept living room brought both comfort and worry. The second-hand furniture and carefully patched curtains told the story of years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Adrian sat on their old plaid couch, still holding the silver picture frame Richard had given him. His eyes were fixed on the twins' peaceful faces. You've been quiet since we left the hospital, Vanessa said, setting her purse down and joining him on the couch. The springs creaked under her weight. What's on your mind, baby? Adrian looked up at his mother, his eyes full of mixed emotions. Mom, I know you're worried about Mr. Bennett's offer, but I saw how tired you were this morning, before your double shift. Maybe. Vanessa wrapped an arm around her son's shoulders, pulling him close. You've got such a big heart, always thinking about others. She sighed deeply. I'm so proud of what you did saving those babies, but accepting help? It's complicated. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Vanessa opened it to find Richard standing there, looking somewhat out of place in his expensive suit. His eyes took in the apartment's modest surroundings, the cramped kitchen with its outdated appliances, the stack of medical textbooks Vanessa used for her nursing studies, the carefully organized homework station where Adrian helped his younger siblings with their schoolwork. I'm sorry for dropping by unannounced, Richard said, his voice soft with understanding. I wanted to see you both in your element, to understand better. Vanessa hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. It's not much, but it's home. Richard noticed the wall of family photos showing moments of joy despite their circumstances. Birthday celebrations with homemade cakes, school achievements proudly displayed, candid shots of the children playing together. You've built something beautiful here, Vanessa. Vanessa stood straighter, pride evident in her stance. We manage. My children never go hungry, and they know they're loved. That's exactly why I want to help, Richard said, turning to face her. Not because you need charity, but because you deserve recognition for raising children with such strong values. Look at Adrian. He didn't think twice about helping strangers, even at risk to himself. Vanessa sank into her favorite chair, the one she'd reupholstered herself 3 times. I've always taught my children that we stand on our own 2 feet, that we earn what we have." Her voice wavered slightly. "How can I accept such a generous offer without feeling like I'm contradicting everything I've taught them?" Richard sat on the edge of the couch, his expression earnest. "You're not contradicting anything. You're showing them that sometimes when you've given so much to others, it's okay to accept something in return. This isn't about charity, it's about recognizing the extraordinary character you've instilled in Adrian." Adrian watched this exchange from his spot on the couch, clutching the framed photo like an anchor. The weight of his mother's struggles and Richard's genuine desire to help filled the small living room with an almost tangible tension. "Mom," Adrian said quietly, "you always tell us that helping others is important. Maybe sometimes it's okay to let others help us too." Dr. Lauren Taylor's footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor as she approached Adrian and Richard, who were sitting in the waiting area. The fluorescent lights cast a soft glow on their worried faces. Adrian had been fidgeting with the sleeve of his shirt while Richard checked his phone repeatedly for updates. "I have good news," Dr. Taylor said, her warm smile lighting up her face. "Claire, the twins' mother, has regained consciousness. She's weak, but her vital signs are stable." Adrian's shoulders relaxed visibly and Richard stood up, running a hand through his graying hair. "How is she? Can I see her?" "She's still quite fragile, but yes, you can visit her briefly," Dr. Taylor explained, turning to Adrian. "She's in room 315, just down the hall from where Emily and Ethan are staying." Richard squeezed Adrian's shoulder gently. "Would you mind watching the twins while I go see Claire? They seem calmer when you're around." Adrian nodded, grateful for the familiar task. As Richard followed Dr. Taylor down the hallway, Adrian headed to the pediatric ward, where the twins were sleeping peacefully in their cribs. In Claire's hospital room, the steady beep of monitors filled the air. She lay propped up against white pillows, her blonde hair tangled and her face pale but alert. When Richard entered, her eyes immediately filled with tears. "The babies," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Richard, where are our babies?" Richard hurried to her bedside, taking her hand in his. "They're perfectly fine, sweetheart. They're right here in the hospital, just down the hall. Not a scratch on them, thanks to a very brave young man." Claire's blue eyes widened. "What happened? I remember the brakes. They wouldn't work. And then nothing." Richard's voice grew thick with emotion as he recounted the story. A 12-year-old boy named Adrian saw the accident. When he noticed smoke coming from the engine, he didn't hesitate. He pulled Emily and Ethan out of the car and carried them all the way to the hospital. Tears streamed down Claire's cheeks. "He saved our babies all by himself?" "He did," Richard nodded, dabbing at her tears with a tissue. "He's been helping care for them ever since. You should see him with them, Claire. He has such a gentle way about him." "I need to meet him," Claire said, gripping Richard's hand tighter. "I need to thank him properly. Can you bring him here?" Meanwhile, in the pediatric ward, Adrian sat in a rocking chair between the twins' cribs, his stomach churning with nervous energy. Dr. Taylor had just told him about Claire's request to meet him, and his mind raced with possibilities. "What if she's angry that I moved them?" he whispered to Emily, who cooed softly in her sleep. "What if she thinks I should have waited for the ambulance?" Dr. Taylor, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped into the room. "You know, Adrian, I've been doing this job for many years, and I can tell you something with absolute certainty. A mother's gratitude for someone who saves her children knows no bounds." Adrian looked up at her, his dark eyes full of uncertainty. "But what if—" "No what ifs," Dr. Taylor said gently, adjusting Ethan's blanket. "You did something extraordinary, and Claire just wants to thank you. Sometimes the simplest truths are the most important ones." Adrian nodded slowly, but his hands still trembled slightly as he watched the twins sleep, waiting for Richard to return and escort him to Claire's room. Richard gently guided Adrian into Claire's hospital room. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the sterile space. Claire lay in her bed, tubes and monitors surrounding her, but her eyes lit up the moment she saw Adrian. "You're the angel who saved my babies," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Tears immediately began rolling down her cheeks. Come closer, sweetheart, please. Adrian shuffled forward nervously, his hands clasped in front of him. Richard placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, encouraging him to move closer to Claire's bedside. I don't know how to thank you enough, Claire said, reaching out to take Adrian's hand. Her grip was weak, but her touch was warm and sincere. My babies. They're everything to me. Everything. Her voice broke as fresh tears spilled down her face. Adrian swallowed hard, fighting back his own emotions. I just did what anyone would do, he said softly. No, Claire shook her head firmly despite her weakness. Not anyone would have done what you did. Richard told me everything. She took a shaky breath before continuing. I remember every terrifying second of that crash. The brakes wouldn't work. I kept pumping them, but nothing happened. I tried to steer away from other cars, but everything was spinning so fast. She paused, squeezing Adrian's hand tighter. The last thing I remember was thinking about my babies in the back seat. I couldn't reach them. I couldn't protect them. But then you came along. Richard pulled up chairs for himself and Adrian, and they sat beside Claire's bed. She wouldn't let go of Adrian's hand as she continued speaking. Richard showed me the security footage, Claire said, her blue eyes intense despite her pale complexion. You didn't even hesitate. You just ran straight to help, even with the smoke coming from the car. Do you know how special that is? Adrian looked down at his shoes, overwhelmed by her gratitude. I was scared, he admitted quietly. But I could hear the babies crying, and I just knew I had to get them out. That's what makes you extraordinary, Claire said, wiping her eyes with her free hand. Being brave isn't about not feeling fear. It's about doing what's right, despite being afraid. She looked at Richard, who nodded in agreement. I want Emily and Ethan to know about you as they grow up, Claire continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. I want them to know about the brave boy who saved their lives. I want them to learn what real courage looks like. Richard stood up suddenly. I have an idea, he said, pulling out his phone. Claire, would you like to see the twins? And maybe we could take a picture together? Claire's face lit up. Yes, please, could you bring them here? Minutes later, Richard returned, pushing a small hospital crib containing both sleeping infants. Dr. Lauren Taylor had given permission for a brief visit, knowing how important this moment was for everyone involved. Claire reached out toward her babies, fresh tears flowing. Adrian helped Richard carefully lift each twin, placing them gently in their mother's arms. The sight of Claire holding her children for the first time since the accident touched everyone in the room deeply. Would you sit here next to us, Adrian? Claire asked softly. I want to remember this moment forever. Adrian carefully perched on the edge of the bed as Richard raised his phone to take the picture. In that quiet hospital room, with the afternoon sun warming them all, Claire held her babies close while Adrian sat beside them, his young face both shy and proud. The camera captured a moment of pure gratitude and connection, a moment that would come to symbolize the beginning of an unbreakable bond between their families. The local newspaper's headline read, 12-year-old hero saves twins from burning car. The story spread like wildfire through their small community. Adrian's photo, standing nervously next to Dr. Lauren Taylor at the hospital, appeared on the front page. The article detailed his quick thinking and courage, highlighting how he'd carried 2 infants through crowded streets to get them medical help. Look at this, Richard said, showing the newspaper to Claire in her hospital room. They got it right. No sensationalism, just the truth about Adrian's bravery. The hospital's security footage of Adrian's arrival had made its way onto social media. The video showed him bursting through the emergency room doors, 2 babies held carefully in his arms, his young face determined despite his obvious fear. It had already gathered thousands of views and shares. The comments are overwhelmingly positive, Dr. Lauren Taylor noted, scrolling through her phone. People are calling him a guardian angel. Adrian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I just wanted to help, he mumbled, looking down at his hands. The attention began following Adrian everywhere. At school, other kids pointed and whispered. In the grocery store, strangers approached him with tears in their eyes, wanting to shake his hand or give him hugs. Some even asked for pictures with him. "You're a hero, young man," an elderly woman told him while he waited for the bus. "We need more people like you in this world." Adrian managed a polite smile, but his shoulders hunched under the weight of all the attention. Dr. Lauren Taylor noticed his discomfort during one of his visits to see the twins. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed," she told him gently. "Being in the spotlight isn't easy, especially when you're not used to it." Meanwhile, Richard had been busy. The revelation about the faulty brakes had ignited something in him. He contacted other victims of similar accidents, gathering evidence and testimonies. With Claire's permission, he shared the security footage of her crash with major news networks. "This isn't just about what happened to us anymore," Richard explained to Adrian during one of their visits. "Your bravery showed me that one person can make a difference. Now it's my turn to try." The pressure on the car manufacturer mounted. News stations picked up the story, featuring both Adrian's heroic rescue and the company's negligence. Reporters interviewed Richard, who spoke passionately about how a 12-year-old boy had more courage than a billion-dollar corporation. "If Adrian hadn't acted so quickly, my children might not be alive today," Richard told the cameras, his voice firm. How many other families weren't as fortunate? How many accidents could have been prevented if this company had put safety before profits? The manufacturer finally buckled under the mounting public pressure. They announced a nationwide recall of all affected vehicles, admitting to the brake defect and promising to cover all repair costs. "You see this?" Richard showed Adrian the announcement on his tablet. "Your actions didn't just save Emily and Ethan, they might have saved countless other lives too." Adrian looked at the news article, his eyes wide. Dr. Lauren Taylor watched from across the room as understanding dawned on his young face. The realization that sometimes one brave act could create ripples that touched many lives. "I never thought," Adrian started, then fell silent, overwhelmed by the impact of what had happened. "That's what real heroes do," Dr. Lauren Taylor said softly. "They inspire others to do better, to be better." The community center buzzed with excitement as neighbors streamed in, carrying homemade dishes and decorations. Hand-painted banners reading "Our Hero Adrian" hung from the walls, and children darted between tables covered in red checkered cloths. The modest celebration had been organized by the Neighborhood Watch Committee, who had watched Adrian grow up on these streets. Adrian stood near the entrance, fidgeting with the collar of his freshly pressed shirt. His eyes widened at the sight of familiar faces. His math teacher, the grocery store owner who always gave him free candy, and even the crossing guard who helped him to school every morning. "Look at all these people who came to celebrate you," Vanessa whispered, squeezing his shoulder. She wore her best dress, the one she usually saved for church, and her eyes sparkled with pride. Mrs. Johnson, their elderly neighbor who always watched Adrian and his siblings when Vanessa worked late shifts, approached with tears in her eyes. "This boy," she said, pulling Adrian into a warm hug, "has always had a heart of gold. Even before all this, he'd help me carry my groceries up the stairs without me asking." More neighbors shared stories about Adrian, how he'd help younger kids with their homework at the community center, or how he'd shovel snow from sidewalks during winter without expecting anything in return. Each story made Adrian blush deeper, but there was a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The room fell quiet as Richard stepped up to the makeshift podium. He looked different today, more relaxed in casual clothes instead of his usual business suit. He cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone. "When I first met Adrian," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion, "I made the mistake of judging him without knowing his character. But this young man taught me more about courage and integrity in one day than I've learned in all my years in business." Adrian watched, wide-eyed, as Richard continued. "Adrian didn't save my children for recognition or reward. He did it because helping others is simply who he is. I've spent time getting to know him and his family over these past weeks, and I've seen that same spirit in everything he does." Richard paused, looking directly at Adrian and Vanessa. "That's why I want to announce something today. I've set up an educational trust fund for Adrian. Whatever career path he chooses, whether it's becoming a doctor like Dr. Lauren Taylor, who's inspired him, or any other dream he pursues, his education will be fully covered." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Richard wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm establishing a community scholarship program in Adrian's name to help other young people in this neighborhood achieve their dreams. Because heroism isn't just about one dramatic moment, it's about the everyday choices we make to help others. Vanessa stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Richard's gesture. She thought about all the nights she'd stayed up worrying about Adrian's future, about college savings she couldn't afford to set aside. Now, watching Richard speak about her son with such genuine respect and admiration, she felt something shift inside her. When Richard finished his speech, Vanessa walked up to him, her head held high. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite her tears. "Not just for this gift, but for seeing my son, really seeing him for who he is." Richard nodded, understanding the significance of her words. This wasn't about charity anymore. It was about recognizing and nurturing the kind of goodness that Adrian had shown, about building bridges between communities that might never have connected otherwise. The celebration continued around them, filled with laughter, music, and the warm embrace of community. Adrian, still shy but smiling more freely now, sat surrounded by neighbors who had become family, his mother's hand firmly clasped in his. Richard's sleek black car became a familiar sight in front of Vanessa's apartment building. He'd arrive with bags of groceries, home repair supplies, or sometimes just his laptop to work while spending time with Adrian. Today, he brought a toolkit to fix the leaky faucet that had been bothering Vanessa for months. "You really don't have to do this," Vanessa said, watching as Richard rolled up his expensive shirt sleeves. "I want to," Richard replied, smiling as Adrian handed him a wrench. "Besides, I'm learning more from Adrian about household repairs than I ever knew before." Adrian beamed with pride. He'd been helping maintain their apartment since he was old enough to hold tools, learning from YouTube videos and neighbors' advice. "Mom says it's important to know how to fix things yourself," he explained. Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Your mom's a wise woman." He watched as Adrian expertly demonstrated how to remove the faucet handle, explaining each step with careful detail. The following week, Richard invited Adrian to join him during the twins' checkup at the hospital. Emily and Ethan's faces lit up when they saw Adrian enter their room. At 6 months old, they were becoming more responsive and their special connection with Adrian was obvious. "They always calm down when you're here," Richard observed, watching Adrian gently rock Emily while Ethan reached for his finger from the hospital crib. "It's like they remember you're their hero." Adrian's cheeks flushed. "I just talk to them like I do with my little brother and sister," he said softly, humming a lullaby his mother used to sing to him. Richard sat in the corner, taking in the scene before him. In his world of corporate meetings and business deals, he'd forgotten the simple joy of watching someone care for others with such natural grace. Adrian didn't check his phone or watch the clock. He was fully present, focused entirely on making the twins feel safe and loved. Later that evening, after Adrian had gone home, Richard stayed behind to talk with Vanessa. They sat in the hospital cafeteria, both cradling cups of coffee. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Richard began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Before the accident, I was barely home. Always another meeting, another deal to close. I'd convinced myself I was doing it all for Claire and the twins, but..." Vanessa listened quietly, recognizing the weight of his confession. "Watching Adrian with my children, seeing how he is with his siblings, it's opened my eyes," Richard continued. "He gives them something money can't buy. His time, his attention, his whole heart. That's just who he is," Vanessa said softly. "Even when things were toughest for us, Adrian never complained about helping with his siblings or doing extra chores. He understood that family means being there for each other." Richard nodded, staring into his coffee. "I've missed so much already. Claire and I both have. We thought providing the best things meant giving them the best life, but Adrian's shown me what really matters." "It's never too late to change," Vanessa said, touching his arm gently. "Every moment you spend with them now is precious. Trust me, I know how fast they grow up." Richard looked at her with grateful eyes. "Thank you, Vanessa, for raising such an amazing son and for helping me see what I've been missing." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Richard's mind kept returning to Adrian's natural way with the twins. how their tiny hands reached for him, how their cries turned to coos when he spoke to them. In Adrian, Richard saw the kind of parent he wanted to become, present, patient, and full of unconditional love. The spring sun warmed the bustling streets as Adrian led Richard through his neighborhood. The familiar sounds of children playing, music drifting from open windows, and friendly chatter filled the air. Adrian walked with confidence, greeting everyone they passed with a bright smile. "That's Mr. Johnson's barbershop," Adrian explained, pointing to a small storefront with a spinning red and white pole. "He gives free haircuts to kids who get good grades, and he taught me how to play chess." Through the window, Mr. Johnson waved, his salt and pepper beard breaking into a wide grin when he spotted Adrian. Richard noticed how the older man's eyes crinkled with genuine affection. "And here's Ms. Rosa's grocery," Adrian continued, leading Richard to a modest corner store. The bell chimed as they entered, and a warm voice called out from behind the counter. "Adrian, mi pequeño héroe." Ms. Rosa emerged, her round face beaming. She hugged Adrian tightly before turning to Richard. "And who is this?" "This is Emily and Ethan's dad," Adrian explained. "He's learning about our neighborhood." Ms. Rosa's eyes softened. "Ah, the twins. Adrian tells me they're doing better. Such a blessing." She pressed a piece of candy into Adrian's hand. "For later, mi amor." As they walked, Richard observed how different this world was from his own. Instead of manicured lawns and security gates, there were community gardens tended by elderly residents. Children played basketball using a milk crate nailed to a telephone pole rather than the professional court in Richard's backyard. Yet there was something here that his wealthy neighborhood lacked: a sense of connection. Everyone knew each other. They shared what little they had. They celebrated each other's victories and supported each other through hardships. "Pastor Mike runs the youth center," Adrian said, pointing to a weathered building with colorful murals. "He helped Mom with groceries when she was between jobs, and he lets kids use the computers for homework." Richard felt a twinge of shame, remembering how he'd initially judged Adrian based on appearances. He'd never bothered to look beyond his own privileged bubble, to see the richness of life in communities like this. They stopped at a small park where several elderly men played dominoes. One of them called out, "Hey Doc, coming to join us?" Adrian blushed. "Not right now, Mr. Williams." "Doc?" Richard asked, curious. "They started calling me that after—" Adrian hesitated, then continued softly. "After the accident with the twins, I told them I want to be like Dr. Taylor someday. Help people, you know?" Richard watched as Adrian's eyes lit up, talking about his dream. "Dr. Taylor showed me that being a doctor isn't just about medicine. It's about caring for people, making them feel safe, like how she believed in me when everyone else was suspicious." The words hit Richard hard. He thought about his own journey to success, the expensive schools, the connections, the opportunities he'd taken for granted. Yet here was Adrian, with so much less, dreaming just as big and working twice as hard. "Sometimes Mom says it's just a dream," Adrian admitted, kicking at a pebble. "Medical school costs too much, but I'm going to find a way. I have to." Richard felt something shift inside him as he looked at this remarkable young man who had saved his children. Adrian's determination, his compassion, his unwavering spirit despite the obstacles. It reminded Richard of his younger self, before money and status had become his primary measure of success. Silently, Richard made a promise to himself. Adrian's dream wouldn't remain just a dream, not if he could help it. Claire's hands trembled as she signed the discharge papers. After weeks in the hospital, she was finally going home with her babies. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, casting a warm glow over Emily and Ethan, who were nestled safely in their car seats. "Easy now," Richard said softly, supporting Claire's elbow as she stood from the wheelchair. Her legs felt weak, but her heart was strong with the desire to hold her children. The doctors had warned her to take it slow, that recovery would be a gradual process, but nothing could dampen the joy of this moment. Tears welled in her eyes as she reached for Emily, carefully lifting her from the car seat. The baby cooed, reaching up to touch her mother's face. "Oh, my sweet girl," Claire whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. "I've missed you so much." Richard picked up Ethan, who giggled and grabbed at his father's tie. The sight made Claire's heart swell. Her family together again. She couldn't help but think about how close they'd come to losing everything. "Richard," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. Taking care of the twins, managing the hospital bills, and especially—" She paused, wiping away a tear. "Especially looking after Adrian and his family. That boy saved our children's lives." Richard's expression softened. "Claire, that young man taught me more about courage and compassion than I've learned in all my years in business. He and his mother, they're remarkable people." Later that afternoon, Claire insisted on visiting Adrian and Vanessa's apartment. Richard drove them there, carrying a basket filled with homemade cookies that Claire had asked her sister to bake. When Adrian opened the door, his eyes widened in surprise. "Mrs. Claire, you're out of the hospital!" His face lit up with genuine happiness. Vanessa appeared behind him, wiping her hands on her nurse's uniform. She'd just returned from her shift. "Please come in," she said warmly, though Claire could see the tired lines around her eyes. Claire stepped forward, still moving carefully, and embraced Adrian. "I never got to properly thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Every time I look at Emily and Ethan, I think about what could have happened if you hadn't been there." Adrian ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he mumbled. "No," Claire said firmly, taking his hand. "Not anyone would have been so brave. Not anyone would have acted so quickly." She turned to Vanessa. "You've raised an extraordinary son." Vanessa's eyes glistened with pride. "He makes it easy," she said softly. Claire sat down on their worn but clean sofa, holding Emily while Richard balanced Ethan on his knee. "I want you both to know that you're always welcome in our home," she said. "Once I'm stronger, I'd love to have you over for dinner. These babies need to know the hero who saved them." The twins gurgled happily as if agreeing with their mother. Adrian smiled, reaching out to let Ethan grab his finger. The connection between them was still strong, even after weeks apart. "We'd like that," Vanessa said, watching her son with the babies. "Though you really don't have to." "Please," Claire interrupted gently. "It's not about obligation. It's about family. And whether by chance or fate, our families are connected now." The hallways of Adrian's school buzzed with whispers as he walked past. Students who had never spoken to him before now waved and called out his name. Some even asked for his autograph, thrusting papers and pens at him. The attention made his stomach churn. During math class, his favorite subject, Adrian found himself unable to concentrate on the equations on the board. His mind kept drifting to the constant stares and comments from his classmates. Even his teachers treated him differently, using him as an example of bravery and quick thinking in their lessons. "Hey, superhero!" a classmate called out during lunch. "Come sit with us!" Adrian clutched his lunch tray tighter, his shoulders tensing. He missed the quiet days when he could eat his sandwich in peace, maybe chat with his few close friends about normal things like video games or homework. Now everyone wanted to hear about the accident, about the twins, about how it felt to be a hero. At home that evening, Adrian sat at the kitchen table, pushing his dinner around his plate without eating. Vanessa noticed his troubled expression as she dried dishes at the sink. "What's on your mind, baby?" she asked, setting down her dish towel and pulling up a chair beside him. Adrian's lower lip trembled. "Mom, I don't know how to handle all this. Everyone at school treats me like I'm different now. They won't leave me alone." His voice cracked. "I just want things to go back to normal." Vanessa wrapped her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "Listen to me, Adrian. What you did was extraordinary, but it didn't change who you are inside. You're still my kind, thoughtful boy who does his homework and helps with his siblings." "But what if I disappoint everyone?" Adrian whispered. "What if I can't live up to what they expect?" "You don't have to live up to anyone's expectations except your own," Vanessa said firmly. "The only person you need to be is yourself." A gentle knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Lauren Taylor stood in the doorway, still in her hospital scrubs. She'd stopped by after her shift, sensing something was wrong when Adrian hadn't visited the twins that afternoon. "May I come in?" she asked softly. Adrian nodded, quickly wiping his eyes. Dr. Taylor pulled up a chair, her kind eyes studying his face. "I heard you've been having a tough time at school," she said. "It's perfectly normal to feel overwhelmed by all this attention." Adrian looked up at her, relief flooding his face at being understood. "Really?" "Absolutely," Dr. Taylor assured him. "You know, when I first became a doctor, saving my first patient's life was overwhelming too. Everyone called me a hero, but I just felt like me, someone who did what needed to be done." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "But here's what I learned, Adrian. Your actions have inspired others, not because you're superhuman, but because you showed them that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they listen to their hearts." Adrian sat up straighter, something shifting in his expression. "I just keep thinking about Emily and Ethan," he admitted. "I didn't think about being brave or special. I just knew they needed help." "And that's exactly what makes you extraordinary," Dr. Taylor smiled. "Not the action itself, but the pure heart behind it." Richard stood at the podium, his normally polished appearance slightly rumpled from sleepless nights spent preparing for this moment. Camera flashes lit up the hotel conference room as reporters jostled for position. Behind him, a large screen displayed photos of the crashed SUV that had nearly claimed the lives of his wife and twins. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice firm despite his nervousness. 2 weeks ago, my family almost died because of a known brake defect in the Morton XL500 SUV. The manufacturer knew about this problem for months, but chose profits over people's lives. He shuffled his notes but didn't look at them. Instead, his eyes swept across the crowd of reporters, making direct contact. "I've spent my career in corporate boardrooms, making decisions that prioritized bottom lines. I understood that mindset, but it took a 12-year-old boy to show me what real courage and responsibility look like." Richard's voice softened as he spoke about Adrian. "When that SUV crashed with my wife and twins inside, Adrian Thompson didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for someone else to take responsibility. He didn't calculate risks or rewards. He simply acted because it was the right thing to do." The room fell silent as Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm ashamed to admit that when I first arrived at the hospital, I questioned Adrian's motives. I saw a young black boy with my children and jumped to conclusions that reflect poorly on me, not him. But Adrian's pure heart and bravery forced me to confront my own biases and prejudices." Cameras clicked rapidly as Richard pulled out the now familiar photo of Adrian with the twins. "This young man taught me more about integrity in one day than I've learned in all my years in business. He showed me that true leadership isn't about protecting yourself. It's about protecting others, even when it's difficult or dangerous." Richard's voice grew stronger as he turned to the main purpose of the conference. "That's why I'm announcing today that I'm filing a class action lawsuit against Morton Motors. Their negligence nearly cost me everything I hold dear. But this isn't just about my family. There are thousands of these defective vehicles still on the road, putting other families at risk." Vanessa watched from the back of the room, her hand resting protectively on Adrian's shoulder. Adrian's eyes were wide as he listened to Richard's words, barely believing that his simple act of helping others had sparked such a change. "I'm establishing a foundation," Richard continued, "dedicated to vehicle safety advocacy and supporting inner-city youth programs. The Adrian Thompson Initiative will ensure that communities like the one that produced such an extraordinary young man receive the resources and attention they deserve." Reporters' hands shot up, but Richard wasn't finished. "We often talk about changing the world, but we rarely acknowledge those who actually do it. Adrian Thompson didn't set out to be a hero or make headlines. He simply saw people in need and helped them. If a 12-year-old boy can show such courage and clarity of purpose, what excuse do the rest of us have?" The press conference exploded with questions, but Richard's attention turned to Adrian and Vanessa at the back of the room. His eyes met Adrian's, and he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. In that moment, the distance between their two worlds seemed to disappear completely. Within hours, video clips of Richard's speech spread across social media. The hashtag #BeLikeAdrian began trending, with people sharing stories of everyday heroism and calling for corporate accountability. Adrian's story was no longer just about one brave act. It had become a catalyst for broader change. The evening sun cast a warm glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's spacious dining room. Adrian sat between his younger siblings, Marcus and Lily, helping them with their napkins, while Vanessa watched with pride. The contrast between their modest apartment and Richard's luxurious home couldn't have been more striking, but somehow, the space felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Claire emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming dish of lasagna, her recovery evident in her confident steps. "I hope everyone likes Italian," she said with a warm smile. "It's my grandmother's recipe." "It smells amazing," Vanessa replied, helping to set the dish on the table. "We usually just have quick meals between my shifts, so this is such a treat." Richard appeared with Emily and Ethan in his arms, the twins babbling happily at the sight of Adrian. "They've been excited all day knowing you were coming," he said, settling them into their high chairs. "They always light up when they see you." 6-year-old Marcus tugged at Adrian's sleeve. "Can we play with the babies after dinner?" he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The adults chuckled, easing any remaining tension. As they shared the meal, stories flowed naturally. Vanessa talked about her early days as a nurse, while Claire shared funny moments from her teaching career. Richard listened intently, occasionally glancing at Adrian, who was carefully cutting up food for 4-year-old Lily. After dinner, Adrian gathered the children in the living room. He spotted some empty paper towel rolls in the recycling bin and had an idea. "Watch this," he said to Emily and Ethan, who sat supported by cushions on the floor. He took the cardboard tubes and arranged them like bowling pins. Using a soft rubber ball he found among the twins' toys, Adrian demonstrated a gentle rolling motion. The tubes toppled with a satisfying sound that made Emily and Ethan giggle. Marcus and Lily joined in, taking turns rolling the ball while Adrian helped the twins clap their hands in celebration. Richard and Claire watched from the doorway, amazed at how Adrian had created such joy from simple items. "He's remarkable," Claire whispered. "The way he connects with them. It's like he knows exactly what they need." In the kitchen, Vanessa helped Richard with the dishes despite his protests that guests shouldn't clean up. "You know," Richard said softly, "I used to think I had everything figured out. Success, status, all of it. But watching Adrian with the twins, seeing how your family supports each other, it's opened my eyes to what really matters." Vanessa paused, drying a plate carefully. "Our worlds are very different," she acknowledged. "But maybe that's why this works. We each have something to learn from the other." Richard nodded, looking out at the children playing. "When I first met Adrian in the hospital, I was so wrapped up in my own prejudices that I almost missed seeing who he really was. Your son, he's teaching me to be a better father, a better person." "And you're showing him that his dreams are possible," Vanessa replied. "That there are people who will believe in him and support him, no matter where he comes from." The sound of collective laughter drew their attention back to the living room. Adrian had created a new game, using paper towel rolls as telescopes, while Marcus and Lily made silly faces through them at the twins. Emily and Ethan were squealing with delight, their tiny hands reaching out for the tubes. The scene before them was more than just a dinner party. It was a testament to how circumstances had brought two very different families together, enriching both their lives in unexpected ways. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows as Richard led Adrian through the sliding doors. Adrian's eyes widened with curiosity, taking in the familiar surroundings from a new perspective. This time there was no emergency, just possibility. "I have a surprise for you," Richard said, guiding Adrian toward the reception desk where Dr. Lauren Taylor waited with a warm smile. "There's my favorite future doctor," Dr. Taylor greeted them, her white coat crisp and professional. "Are you ready for a behind-the-scenes tour of what doctors do every day?" Adrian's face lit up. "Really? We get to see everything?" "Well, almost everything," Dr. Taylor laughed, handing him a visitor's badge. "I've arranged for you to observe some of our daily routines and meet different medical professionals." As they walked through the corridors, Dr. Taylor explained the various departments and their functions. Adrian absorbed every detail, asking thoughtful questions that made Richard and Dr. Taylor exchange knowing looks. In the pediatric ward, they watched as a young doctor examined a child with a stethoscope, explaining each step to worried parents. Adrian noticed how the doctor's gentle manner helped the small patient relax. "That's exactly how you were with Emily and Ethan," Richard remarked quietly. "You have that same natural ability to make people feel safe." They visited the nursing station where busy staff coordinated patient care. A nurse demonstrated how to read vital signs on the monitors, and Adrian listened intently, his eyes bright with interest. "Your mother would be proud to see you here," Dr. Taylor said. "She's one of our most dedicated nurses, you know. Healthcare seems to run in your family." In the emergency department, they observed the organized chaos from a safe distance. Adrian watched in awe as medical teams worked together seamlessly, each person knowing their role. "This is where it all happened," Adrian said softly, remembering the day he brought in the twins. Dr. Taylor squeezed his shoulder. "And that day showed me something special about you, Adrian. You have exactly what we look for in doctors: quick thinking, compassion, and courage under pressure." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in blue paper. "I have something for you." Adrian carefully unwrapped it to find a high-quality stethoscope, gleaming silver in the fluorescent light. His name was engraved on the chest piece: Adrian, future MD. "This is too much," he whispered, running his fingers over the engraving. "Not at all," Dr. Taylor replied. "I see great potential in you, Adrian. This is just a small reminder of what's possible." While Adrian practiced listening to his own heartbeat, Richard pulled Vanessa aside in the hospital cafeteria. She had joined them during her break, watching her son's joy from a distance. "I want to set up a scholarship fund for Adrian," Richard said quietly, "to ensure he can pursue medical school without worrying about costs." Vanessa's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "Richard, that's incredibly generous, but—" "I know what you're thinking," Richard interrupted gently, "but this isn't about owing anyone anything. It's about investing in a bright young man who's already proven his worth 10 times over." Vanessa watched Adrian across the room, his face serious as Dr. Taylor showed him how to properly wear the stethoscope. "I don't want him to feel pressured," she said softly, "or like he has to live up to someone else's expectations." "The money would be there with no strings attached," Richard assured her. "Whether he becomes a doctor or chooses a completely different path, it would be his choice. I just want to remove any barriers that might hold him back." Adrian sat at his desk, tapping his pencil thoughtfully against his notebook. Mrs. Peterson had just announced their latest writing assignment, "A Person Who Inspires Me." While his classmates immediately started scribbling about celebrities and athletes, Adrian knew exactly who he wanted to write about. The classroom was quiet except for the soft scratching of pencils and the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Adrian began writing about his mother, Vanessa. The words flowed easily as he described her long nights at the hospital, her endless patience with his younger siblings, and her unwavering strength in the face of challenges. "She works 12-hour shifts as a nurse," he wrote, "but still finds time to help us with homework and make sure we never go to bed hungry. Even when she's tired, she never complains. She taught me that being brave isn't about doing something big and heroic. It's about showing up every day for the people who need you." As he wrote, Adrian remembered all the times he'd seen his mother come home exhausted but still managed to smile, to ask about their day, to make sure everyone was okay. He described how she'd taught him to care for his siblings, to be responsible, and to always think of others. The next day, Mrs. Peterson called on students to share their essays. When it was Adrian's turn, he walked to the front of the class, his paper clutched tightly in his hands. The same classmates who had treated him like a celebrity after the rescue now listened attentively as he read about his mother. "My mom doesn't wear a cape or have superpowers," Adrian read, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But she's the strongest person I know. She shows me every day that real heroes are the ones who keep going even when things are hard, who put others first and who never give up on their family." The classroom fell silent when he finished. Then, slowly, his classmates began to applaud. Adrian saw genuine smiles on their faces, not because he was the kid from the news, but because they understood and respected his words. Later that evening, Adrian found his mother sitting at their kitchen table after her shift. He handed her the essay, suddenly shy. "Mrs. Peterson said I should show this to you," he mumbled. Vanessa began reading, her tired eyes moving across the page. As she read, tears began to well up. Adrian watched as she pressed her hand to her mouth, overcome with emotion. "Oh, Adrian," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "This is beautiful." "I meant every word," Adrian said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Vanessa held him at arm's length, her eyes shining. "You know, I'm proud of you for so many reasons. Yes, what you did for those twins was incredible. But what makes me proudest is the person you are every day. How you help with your siblings, how you work hard at school, how you always think about others' feelings." Adrian felt warmth spread through his chest at his mother's words. "I learned it all from you, Mom." "And you've taken those lessons and made them your own," Vanessa said, wiping her eyes. "That's what makes you special, Adrian. Not just one brave moment, but all the small moments of kindness that make up who you are." They sat together at the kitchen table, the essay between them, sharing a moment of quiet understanding. The evening light filtered through their small kitchen window, casting a warm glow over mother and son, bound together by love, sacrifice, and mutual admiration. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Claire's elegant suburban home, as Vanessa and Adrian walked up the flower-lined pathway. Adrian held a small bouquet of flowers they'd picked up on the way, his hands slightly trembling with nervous excitement. Claire opened the door before they could ring the bell, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "You made it!" she exclaimed, ushering them inside. The twins, now 7 months old, were propped up in their bouncy seats in the living room, cooing at the sight of visitors. The house smelled of fresh-baked bread and herbs, and Claire led them to a beautifully set dining table. "I hope you like lasagna," she said, pulling out chairs for her guests. "It's my grandmother's recipe." As they settled in, Claire brought out a thick photo album, its pages carefully preserved. "I wanted to share something special with you both," she said, opening to the first page. "These are from the day the twins were born." Adrian leaned forward, fascinated by the images of tiny Emily and Ethan in the hospital. Claire's finger traced over each photograph as she shared the stories behind them. Their first day home, their first smiles, the way they would hold hands while sleeping. "It's amazing how much they've grown," Vanessa commented, watching as the twins wiggled in their seats. Claire nodded, wiping away a tear. "And they might not have had the chance if it weren't for Adrian." She reached under the table and pulled out a wrapped package. "Which is why I wanted to give you this." Adrian carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a silver frame with a recent photo of Emily and Ethan, their matching grins showing off their first teeth. Below the photo was an engraved message: "To our guardian angel, love, Emily, and Ethan." Attached to the frame was a handwritten note. Adrian read it silently, his eyes growing misty. "Dear Adrian, some people spend their whole lives wondering if they'll ever make a difference in the world. At 12 years old, you've already saved 2 lives and changed ours forever. You are proof that angels walk among us, disguised as ordinary people who do extraordinary things. With eternal gratitude, Claire." "I don't know what to say," Adrian whispered, carefully touching the frame. Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that Emily and Ethan will grow up knowing about their hero." As Adrian went to play with the twins, Claire and Vanessa moved to the kitchen to prepare dessert. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on the joys and challenges of motherhood. "Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping it together," Claire admitted, cutting slices of apple pie. "Especially now, being a single parent while recovering." Vanessa nodded, understanding. I know that feeling all too well. There are times when I wonder if I'm doing enough, being enough. But look at Adrian, Claire said softly, glancing toward the living room where Adrian was making silly faces at the giggling twins. You've raised an amazing young man. That takes incredible strength. It takes a village, Vanessa replied, watching her son with pride. And sometimes that village comes from unexpected places. The two women shared a knowing look, their different lives now connected by circumstances neither could have predicted. In the living room, Emily reached for Adrian's finger, while Ethan babbled happily, the bond between them all growing stronger with each passing moment. The grand conference room at the city's convention center buzzed with anticipation. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking steadily as reporters shuffled in their seats, notebooks ready. Richard stood at the podium, his usually pristine suit slightly rumpled from a long day of meetings. But there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before all this began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "Today marks a victory not just for my family, but for every family who has ever put their trust in Valley Motors." He paused, shuffling the papers before him. "After months of negotiation and pressure, I'm pleased to announce that Valley Motors has agreed to a full recall of all XC90 models manufactured between 2020 and 2023 due to faulty brake systems." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as Richard continued. "This recall will affect approximately 450,000 vehicles nationwide. Valley Motors has committed to covering all repair costs and providing temporary replacement vehicles to affected families." Richard's hands gripped the podium tighter, but I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for the courage of one young man. He turned slightly, gesturing to where Adrian sat quietly between Vanessa and Dr. Lauren Taylor. "Adrian Thompson didn't know my children. He didn't know my wife. But when he saw smoke rising from our overturned SUV, he didn't hesitate. He acted with pure instinct and compassion, saving my twins from what could have been a tragic fate." The cameras swiveled toward Adrian, who shrunk slightly in his chair. Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Adrian's bravery opened my eyes. It made me realize that we all have a responsibility to act when we see something wrong. His courage inspired me to fight for this recall, to ensure no other family would face what we did." "Adrian," Richard said, extending his hand toward the boy, "would you please join me up here?" Adrian looked uncertainly at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. He rose slowly and made his way to the podium, his sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. The entire room burst into applause, people rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. Richard stepped aside, gently guiding Adrian to the microphone. Adrian swallowed hard, looking out at the sea of faces. His voice came out soft at first, then grew stronger as he spoke. I didn't do anything special," he began, his honesty touching the hearts of everyone in the room. "I just saw someone who needed help, and I knew I had to do something. My mom always taught me that we have to look out for each other, even when it's scary." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You don't have to save someone from a car crash to make a difference. Sometimes just being kind or helping someone who's struggling can change their whole day, maybe even their life." His words, simple yet profound, caused several reporters to wipe their eyes discreetly. "If you see someone who needs help," Adrian continued, his voice growing more confident, "don't wait for someone else to step up. Be the person who makes things better. That's all I did, and that's all any of us needs to do." The room erupted in another round of applause, even more enthusiastic than before. Reporters stood, phones recording Adrian's impromptu speech. In the back of the room, a social media coordinator's phone buzzed continuously as Adrian's words began spreading across the internet, touching hearts far beyond the conference room walls. Richard stood beside Adrian, his hand resting proudly on the boy's shoulder as camera flashes filled the room with bursts of light. The moment captured perfectly how one act of courage had sparked a chain reaction of positive change, making the world a little bit safer for everyone. The hospital's small conference room felt intimate and warm, sunlight streaming through large windows as Richard and Vanessa sat across from each other. A folder containing scholarship documents lay between them on the polished wooden table. Richard watched as Vanessa carefully read through each page, her fingers tracing the lines of text. "It's completely separate from any personal gifts," Richard explained softly. "This is a proper educational trust managed by an independent board. Adrian would have access to it when he starts college, specifically for his medical studies." Vanessa looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. It's more than generous, Richard. But I need to know, why are you doing this?" Richard leaned forward, his usual businesslike demeanor softening. "Because your son showed me what true courage looks like. He saved my children without thinking twice, and now I want to make sure nothing stands in the way of his dreams." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't charity, Vanessa. It's an investment in a young man who I believe will help countless others once he becomes a doctor." Vanessa sat quietly for a moment, then picked up the pen. "Adrian has always been special," she said, her voice thick with pride. "He deserves this chance." She signed the documents with steady hands, each signature representing her acceptance of this gift for her son's future. Later that afternoon, the pediatric wing's meeting room was transformed with simple decorations. Hospital staff gathered around, many wearing their white coats and scrubs. Dr. Lauren Taylor stood near the front, beaming with pride as Adrian entered with his mother. Richard stepped forward, addressing the small crowd. "Today we're here to celebrate a young man who showed us all what it means to be brave." He turned to Adrian, whose eyes widened in surprise. "Adrian, your quick thinking saved my children's lives, but what's impressed me most is your dream of helping others as a doctor." Adrian glanced at his mother, who was smiling through tears. Richard continued, "That's why I'm establishing the Adrian Thompson Medical Scholarship Fund. When you're ready for medical school, this fund will cover your entire education." The room burst into applause as Adrian stood frozen in shock. Dr. Lauren Taylor stepped forward, holding something behind her back. "Adrian," she said warmly, "every doctor's journey begins with a first step." She revealed a pristine stethoscope, its silver and black surface gleaming under the lights. "This is yours now." Adrian's hands trembled as he accepted the stethoscope. I don't know what to say," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you all so much." He looked at Richard, then Dr. Taylor, and finally his mother. "I promise I'll work as hard as I can. I want to help people just like you all helped me." Dr. Lauren Taylor demonstrated how to properly wear the stethoscope, and Adrian's face lit up as he heard his first heartbeat through it. The hospital staff gathered around, sharing encouraging words and stories from their own journeys in medicine. Vanessa watched her son, surrounded by support and encouragement, and felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. Richard stood beside her, both of them watching Adrian interact with the medical staff, his new stethoscope proudly draped around his neck. "Thank you," Vanessa whispered to Richard, "for believing in him." Richard nodded, his own eyes misty as they watched Adrian listening intently to Dr. Lauren Taylor's explanation of heart sounds. The boy's face showed the same determination and focus he'd displayed on that fateful day at the crash site, but now it was directed toward his future, a future that was suddenly much brighter and more certain than before. The spring afternoon was perfect for a picnic, with gentle sunlight warming the park's grassy expanse. Colorful blankets spread across the ground created a cozy space where both families gathered. Adrian sat cross-legged on a checkered blanket, making silly faces at Emily and Ethan, who giggled and reached for him with tiny hands. "They absolutely adore him," Claire said softly to Vanessa as they arranged containers of sandwiches and fruit. "It's amazing how they light up whenever they see him." Vanessa watched her son gently tickle the twins, his natural care for them evident in every interaction. "He's always had a way with little ones," she replied, pride warming her voice. "Even with his younger siblings, he just knows what they need." Richard stood nearby, setting up a portable shade tent for the babies. He paused his work, taking in the scene before him. The sound of laughter, Adrian's playful chuckles mixing with the twins' delighted squeals, filled the air. It was so different from the formal, structured gatherings he'd been used to before the accident. Finding a quiet moment, Richard approached Vanessa. "I need to thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "The way you've raised Adrian, he's taught me so much about what really matters in life." Vanessa smiled, understanding the depth of his words. "We all did the best we could," she replied. "But Adrian, he's always had this special light inside him." As the afternoon wore on, the families shared stories over lunch. Claire told amusing tales of the twins' first attempts at solid food, while Vanessa shared memories of Adrian's early years. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by frequent laughter and knowing nods. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. Emily and Ethan, tired from their day of play, naturally gravitated to Adrian. He sat back against a tree, cradling one twin in each arm as they drifted off to sleep. Their tiny hands clutched at his shirt, their peaceful faces showing complete trust and contentment. Claire captured the moment on her phone, showing the picture to Vanessa. "Look at them," she whispered. "It's like they know they're safe with him." "We're family now," Richard said quietly, looking at the assembled group. "All of us, and we always will be." The others nodded in agreement, understanding that their lives had become beautifully intertwined through an act of courage that brought them together. The setting sun cast long shadows across their picnic spot, but their hearts were full of warmth and gratitude for the bonds they'd formed. Adrian sat at his small desk by the window, carefully writing on crisp, stationery paper. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across his workspace as he poured his heart into the thank you letter. "Dear Richard, Claire, and Dr. Taylor," he wrote, taking extra care with his handwriting. "These past few months have changed my life in ways I never expected." He paused, thinking about the twins' sweet smiles and how far they'd come from that terrifying day of the crash. He continued writing, describing how Richard's mentorship had shown him what was possible when people believed in you. He thanked Claire for letting him remain part of the twins' lives, and expressed his gratitude to Dr. Taylor for inspiring his dream of becoming a doctor. "Your kindness and support have made me believe that anything is possible," Adrian wrote, his eyes growing misty. "I promise to work hard and make you all proud." Later that week, Adrian visited the hospital one last time before summer break. The familiar halls felt different now, less intimidating, more like a place of hope. He found Dr. Taylor in her office, surrounded by children's drawings and medical charts. "Adrian," she greeted him warmly, standing up to give him a hug. "Look how much you've grown." They sat together near the window overlooking the hospital garden. Dr. Taylor's eyes were kind as she spoke. "You know, Adrian, what you did that day wasn't just about saving Emily and Ethan. Your courage created ripples of kindness that keep spreading." She gestured to a bulletin board where newspaper clippings about the car recall were pinned. "Because of you, Richard fought for change. Other families are safer now. And the way you brought two different families together, that's inspired so many people." Adrian nodded shyly, understanding the truth in her words. The hospital visit felt like closing a chapter, but also like the beginning of something new. Walking home with Vanessa afterward, they passed the neighborhood playground. A group of kids were playing basketball, their laughter floating through the air. Adrian watched them for a moment, remembering how different everything had felt just months ago. "You're quiet," Vanessa said softly, squeezing his hand. "Just thinking," Adrian replied, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. "About everything that's happened, about how helping someone can change so much." They continued walking, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Adrian felt light inside, knowing that his simple act of bravery had created something beautiful, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. If you enjoyed the story of Winston, Adrian, Vanessa, and the twins, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.